Right, everyone, let's make a start. We now have 85 out of the 90 minutes for this plenary left to hear two fantastic speakers, and they've got the after lunch slot and they're between us and coffee. So we're going to have to rely on the power of our ideas and imaginations to keep us going for the next 90 minutes. I thought I'd start with a pub quiz. Only two questions. So first question, how many papers have been presented to the DSA this year? How many are on the program? Tell your neighbor what the answer is. And Jay, you're not allowed to answer this question because you've counted them all. How many papers are there in the program? It only requires one number.
Eh?
All right, so.
They told me there were 500 people, so.
Okay, right, that's the first question. Anybody know the answer?
400.
200? 400?
400.
More? Anybody get higher? How many? No more? So the answer is, Jay? 568. And that's not including the ones that were rejected. Yeah. And that's relevant to this afternoon's session because it's a lot to get your head around. And so thinking about the evolution of ideas and development and how in our own heads we classify different presentations and papers is really important. So a session on the evolution of ideas, cleavages in ideas is really important. Yeah. Second pub question, and again, share the answer with your neighbor. What does the word schismogenesis mean? And I'd be, bonus marks for a reference.
Divisions between, division something. Yes.
Yeah, good. Anybody? You either know this or you don't know it, unless you speak Latin. Anybody? Anybody bold enough to say where it comes from? I made it up. Asher. You know me too well. It comes from David Graeber and David Wengrow's book on the new history of mankind or something like that. And it's the cultural process of defining yourself against another, which they argue is fundamental to the evolution of societies in pre-agrarian revolutions and since. Yeah, and it's highly relevant to this afternoon's discussion because we're going to be thinking about the relationship between development studies and economics. Yeah, and in my experience, which is relatively recent, it's only about 35 years. There's a certain amount of othering or schismogenesis going on. And we want to get beyond that. Yeah. The Journal of Development Studies, which is sponsoring this session, I know over the years has worked very hard to broaden the input of papers so that it isn't economics dominated, but it's read by economists and valued by economists. So a constructive approach to this particular form of othering. So it's appropriate that this session is sponsored by the Journal of Development Studies. And I know that Uma, where's Uma? Here. Uma as what do you call yourself? Director, Chief Coordinator, President, Bottle Wash. Yeah, okay. It's also, and the council are concerned with how we keep the tent broad in a constructive way. Yeah. So it's a great pleasure that Jayati Ghosh on the screen and Diego hiding in the front here, but he will come out in the flesh, have agreed to talk to this topic and to reflect on it. So we're going to give them 20 minutes each, or 25 if they push it. And then we're going to have lots of time for discussion and for people to make their contributions to this issue. So I won't introduce you very much, but Jayati, I'm sure many people know. I think you're now at the University of Amherst. Where's that? Massachusetts. Yeah. Yes. But for many years at JNU, which is another story. People will know you for lots of things, including your work on gender and work and care. You have quite recently written a book on actually, this could be another pub quiz. What do our two speakers have in common? They've both written books about the pandemic fairly recently. Jayati specifically about the making of a catastrophe, the disasters of economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic in India. So with no more ado, over to you, Jayati, and good luck.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be part of this panel, although I'm really sorry I couldn't make it physically to Bath. I'm in Spain, not too far away, but unfortunately couldn't come and join you there right now. But I'm also delighted at the way you have thought of this panel. And I have to say, schismogenesis is a perfect way of talking about the relationship of economics to broader development studies, because I think, mainstream economics has been, if you like, the global leader in this one. We are really way ahead of the game in terms of creating silos for ourselves, admittedly defining economics as somehow superior to other social studies, because we think of ourselves as a science, although I firmly believe we're not a science in the natural science way, and somehow seeing this as the most fundamental, most important, and somehow separable from other social studies. And I think that's been to the detriment of economics. It's really been something that has affected our own quality, and it's obviously to the detriment of development studies as well. So I'm really delighted that we are getting an opportunity to exchange and to figure out how to solve this particular siloization and this schizogenesis is the word, right? I did go through that book. Obviously I didn't go through it clearly enough, so I haven't remembered that phrase well, but it works well. So let me begin with two levels of criticism about economics. And one is a criticism that's easy for me to make because it's about mainstream economics, which I'm not part of. So it's easy for me to say lots of bad things about it. The second set of criticisms is going to be more about the kind of economist I am, the heterodox lot, if you like. But let me begin with the first. I think, economics as a discipline, one of the reasons why we have become increasingly irrelevant to the real problems of our time, which we all know what they are. I don't have to go back and tell you all about the nature of, whether it is climate change, the inability to develop for the greater majority of humankind, the kinds of threats that are posed geopolitically, socioeconomically, etc., etc. The sheer inability of economics to predict, understand, or even project responses to this is a reflection of the way economics as a discipline has developed, which is to say that because of this urge to see ourselves as scientific, there was this push to abstract models that could be subject to a much more mathematical treatment, to a more modeling treatment, which meant you had to, if you like, leave out the fluff, or even if you have to leave out even things which are completely relevant, but they don't fit easily into a model. And that worked for both microeconomics and macroeconomics, which I believe has been hugely detrimental to the analysis of development, because development, you can't afford to do that. And I think pretty much everyone in the audience who is not an economist will immediately recognize that particular point. if you look back at the early development economists, and I don't mean Smith, Ricardo, and all whom everybody accepts as the early development economists, but the ones who were actually studying the economy well before that, let's say the Italians, Giovanni Botero and others, who identified how economies grew or didn't and what caused that, they were looking at processes. They were not looking at a point, a static point, and comparing it with another static point. They saw things in evolutionary terms through processes. That is something that mainstream economics lost somewhere in the late 19th century and kept losing it throughout. So we were always engaged in what is called comparative statics. You compare two different states. And time as an element, therefore, doesn't really figure. You can, it's almost like you could go, forward and backward across these two states. That if you've taken a particular path, there isn't, a trajectory that is then forced on you. There is no hysteresis. There is no path dependence in those kinds of studies. And unfortunately, development economics, which earlier in the 1950s and 60s was much more aware of processes, the sort of high noon of Western development economics, broadly speaking, was with people like Hirschman and Rostow, etc., etc. Now, all of them were actually aware of processes and talked about processes. We have then moved much more significantly towards two things. One, you could call it a miniaturization, a move to the micro, which is exemplified in what is now seen as the sort of gold standard of development, which is to say RCTs, randomized control trials, which are comparative statics exercises, right? Where you're treating reality as a form of lab where you shift one variable and say, well, that's the thing that makes this much difference or doesn't make this much difference. I believe that has been a real wrong turn in development economics. And it's a wrong turn for many, many different reasons. One is, of course, the ethical reason. I mean, the use of human beings as, if you like, lab rats. Not that I'm in favor of using lab rats either, but, that's much more complicated. But also the lack of an awareness of either history or context. That an experiment that could yield a result in one particular social situation could well yield a completely different result in a different social situation, or even in that same social situation later in time. Okay, so it's not a gold standard. In fact, it's the absolute opposite. It is really a wrong turn, I believe, in development economics, because one of its major proponents has described it as something that shows that we economists are plumbers. We go and fix systems. The water flow is not okay here, so this is the lever we turn, and this is the wedge that we bring about there. No, that's not what economics is about, and that's not what development is about either, right? It's about processes. So at the micro level, or shifting to the micro level, has been one real loss. But then the other big loss has been shifting at the macro level. We've made similar mistakes as economists. We have gone for the simplified models because they allow us to make predictions, projections, give us results, allow us to do fairly complicated econometrics because of the way we have framed the model. But then they leave out the things that are inconvenient. So we have trade models which assume perfect competition, which, let's face it, doesn't exist now, but never existed. They assume full employment, which certainly doesn't exist now and pretty much didn't exist for most countries for most of the time over history. They assume no economies of scale, constant returns to scale. Again, same issue, right? There are all these unrealistic assumptions that give us trade models about comparative advantage, that tell countries, oh, you should focus on doing the labor-intensive stuff, don't do this other thing because it's not your comparative advantage. It tells us how to do industrial policy. Turns out to be all wrong as well, because you haven't been looking at how these things can change and how the assumptions themselves are wrong. We have models of capital flow which say capital is like water. It will find its own level. Capital will flow wherever, the profits are higher, and until profit rates are equalized or returns on capital are equalized across the world. Again, absolute nonsense, right? Anyone who knows anything about the world economy knows that's not true. So obviously there's a wrong assumption there. And what's the critical thing that we have been leaving out in all of this, all the time? We have been leaving out power. Okay, so in a way, one of the big failures of mainstream economics is that in its search for finding clear, analytically acceptable, empirically verifiable, if you think of a lot of the fancy stats as necessarily verifying anything, has resulted in outcome, well, in analyses and in policy predictions that are frankly unrealistic. Okay, so power, one big thing that we leave out. Now, there's been a lot of recent work about how microeconomics in particular has also had a very wrong idea of human motivation, which you didn't need a lot of RCTs to tell you. I mean, we could have told you that before, right? The basic minimum assumption of micro is that there is utility maximization, and for a worker, it's the maximization between work, which gives you money, and leisure. That's the thing that defines it. That gives you your labor supply schedules, right? That's nonsense, because if that were true, there would be no unpaid care in any economy. Okay, and we know that unpaid care is the bedrock on which all economies rest. So it was already a nonsensical assumption, but it's been used continuously throughout. Now, did this lack of acceptance, now suddenly people say, oh, wait a minute, actually human motivation is different, and I'm going to do an experiment and discover that people don't always respond only to monetary incentives. And it's supposed to be a real eureka moment, saying, oh, wow, that means we have to rethink how psychology works. Honestly, to me, that's another kind of failure, because it's something that we in economics do a lot of, and I'd be very interested to know how in the other disciplines you do that. We pick something from another discipline. In this case, let's say psychology, or maybe it is even, I mean, a lot of the RCT work comes from the kinds of work that people do in medicine and biology and so on, right? We pick a thing from another discipline, and then we kind of apply it, and we say, oh, look, and we're being all, now we're interdisciplinary. Or we say, look, I am an economist and I'm working with another person from another discipline, maybe a psychologist, maybe a climate scientist, maybe whatever, and therefore we are interdisciplinary. I really believe we have to get out of that. We have to stop saying inter and try and make ourselves into being transdisciplinary. In other words, it's no longer good enough for an economist to pick an idea or a concept from some other discipline, or to say, I'm working with X who is from another discipline. It is necessary for us to learn enough of that to imbue our own perspectives with that. We will not be good economists if we are not fully aware of the social context, the historical background, the socio-cultural, if you like, the psychological motivations of that particular thing that we are studying. We will not be good economists if we do not bring a sense of history and of the processes unfolding, and of the fact that once a process has gone in a particular direction, you can't move back. You have to move on the basis of what has already happened. So we have to become transdisciplinary. So I'm being provocative, and I can imagine many people who are economists, perhaps even sitting here in this room, are going to say, I'm completely off the charts on this one. But I genuinely feel that the only way economics can be useful in the analysis of development is if we stop being the kinds of economists we have been and start being transdisciplinary. And that I want to bring back also to my own, if you like, my own kin in economics, the heterodox crowd. And I want to emphasize that a lot of those mistakes are also made by heterodox economists. It's not only just, the mainstream ones whom it's easy to criticize at many levels. It's also a lot of heterodox economists who make this mistake of, if you like, cherry picking little bits from other disciplines, not genuinely engaging with the perspective of that discipline, but just sort of, exchanging a few ideas across them and saying, okay, yes, interdisciplinary. I think we really, all of us, have to become transdisciplinary if we're supposed to understand development at all. But I have a feeling, have I exceeded my time? I'm kind of not aware, but maybe I should stop here. And anyway, I'm sure we're going to have a much more interesting discussion than anything I could tell you more. So let me stop here then.
Right, okay. So that was actually only 10 minutes.
I can't believe it. I can go on if you like.
No, we'll hold you in reserve. But we do want to maximize the time for discussion. And so after Diego's spoken, we'll bring you back in to respond to questions and comments that others have. So now over to Diego Sanchez Ancochea from the Oxford Department for International Development, who many of you will know, who, when did we first meet? When you were in the University of London,
Yes,
at the Centre for
London.
Latin American Studies.
Yes.
And I can remember kind of going into your office off Russell Square.
Yes.
Yeah. And thinking, whoa, this guy is serious. It was Matteo who introduced me, and I thought, so yeah. And so it's been fantastic to see how you have challenged our views about welfare regimes and social protection and productivist regimes and many other things, and classification of countries since, how you've been writing like Jayati about the pandemic, obviously teaching us to learn from Costa Rica as well. So over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Let me start by thanking Mihika for the invitation and also Winnie for all the organization. It's really an honor to be here with you all in the DSA conference, and particularly to share a panel with Jayati and with James. I'm going to try to think a little bit about the history of the relationship between economics and development studies, although I am going to narrow very clearly what development studies is, and some of you will disagree very much with that, the way I will do it. But I want to think about this relationship and how this relationship has evolved over time, and hopefully also to think about the future and how the relationship can be reworked or can be thought in certain ways. To do that, however, I'm going to narrow very much what development studies is, because as you know very well, you are all practicing that discipline or that group of disciplines. It's a very broad one, and I want to narrow it down. To do that, let me use the work of Andy Sammer, who identified 4 different types of development studies: aid-dependent, critical development studies, global development studies, and the one that I want to focus on, which is classical development studies. He talks about it as a way to think about the structural transformation of middle-income countries, and very much with the perspective of history. In a way, I think when he talked about it, he was really talking about the political economy of development. And here I have to be a big warning. There's a lot of different people working on political economy and understanding the concept in a very different way. So let me tell you how I understand this, and how I understand then and explore the relationship with economics. So I think the type of political economy of development that I have in mind first is very much concentrated on what we can call equitable structural transformation. It's about how countries are able to transform their economies, to develop new sectors, and to increase productivity, but doing it in a way that is equitable and benefit a majority of the population. It's one that thinks a lot about the constraints, both internal and external, on the process of growth. Those constraints might be done by economic conditions, like the low saving rate, or might be by dependence from the global economy. And this is very much related to this issue. it's a political economy that thinks a lot about the role of the state. And the role of the state plays a significant function in the process of transformation, both sometimes replacing markets and many times leading markets in certain directions. Is one that thinks a lot about power, and it's important what Jayati said about power. This is an approach that thinks a lot about the way power relations take place, thinks about how society relates to the state, but also thinks a lot about relations of dependence between countries in the global south and countries in the global north. So if you accept for a second, and again, there might be a lot of political economists that think about it in a very different way, but if you accept that this might be a workable definition, the question is how this group of work has related to development economics across the last 50 to 60, well, no, now 70 years. And the starting point, I think, is actually that both of them were one and the same thing. That development economics, when it starts with the work of Albert Hirschman, Rosenstein-Rodin, Myrdal, and others, is very much what development economics was. And it's very much thinking about the element. If you think about the pioneers of development in what we can call the Anglo-Saxon world, so as I have mentioned, Hirschman, Myrdal, Rosenstein-Rodin, and others, Arthur Ruiz and others, they defined development, political economy of development and development economics in terms of a set of dimensions that are still influential today. The first is the notion of the role of complementarities and linkages, the idea that in the process of development, what you need is to create complementarities between different sectors of the economy, and those sectors of the economy in a big push, as Rosenstein-Rodin mentioned, have to be developed at the same time, or in a very slightly different approach, in a debate that was very intense between those in favor of balanced and unbalanced growth, the notion of linkages that Albert Hirschman used, in which is about how specific sectors of the economy are able to push the rest of the economy with them. And of course, the concept of linkage became then extremely important for the whole discussion on global value chains and for the way the economy is organized. It was a political economy that thought a lot about the role of poverty, and again, the links between poverty and production. Thinking about the vicious circles of poverty that might be created by problems of supply, insufficient productivity, for example, or problems of demand, insufficient purchasing power from the population to be able to transform the economy and in that way reduce poverty. It was very much a political economy that thought about the conditions of the labor market and the problem of dual labor markets in which there were very significant differences between low productivity and high productivity sectors. Again, something that is still valid today for many economies, not just in the global south, but inclusively we see dualism in the global north. And finally, it was the pioneers of development thought a lot about the role of the state in the process of transformation and very much to reduce, to promote complementarities, reduce dualism, and eliminate the vicious circles. We needed a state that was active in planning and in promoting industrial policy. For me, what is interesting is that, of course, the pioneers of development were not just people developing their ideas in the UK and the US, but also very much in other parts of the world, including the Latin American context. So this is Mafalda. I don't know how many of you know her. It's an Argentinian girl, which in this case is asking, what do the South do to deserve these kinds of Norths? And this is very much what the structuralist ideas in the Latin American context were developed precisely at the same time as the Anglo-Saxon pioneers of development. They also thought about the state as particularly important, but placed the state within the global organization of production and the global structure of production. It is very much based on the distinction between centers and periphery and how they were structurally different in terms of how they organized their economies. Structurally different in two different ways. The first is that the global north, the center, was very much diversified between different sectors of the economy. So there were a lot of different exports, a lot of different activities being produced, while what we have seen in the periphery, I hope this doesn't mean I'm losing you, and that's why, let me change, let me actually change. They very much on the specialization in mining or in other activities in the case of the periphery. And the second big difference between the center and periphery is a concept that has a lot to do with dualism, which is the fact that in the global north, in the center, the different sectors of the economy have relatively similar levels of productivity. While in the periphery, there are very significant differences between different sectors of the economy, with very high productivity in activities like mining, but very low in others. And the problem, of course, as you know, is that this way of organizing the economy and these differences in terms of structure led to what was called the decrease in terms of trade. The idea that exports from the global south were increasing at lower speed than the prices of exports from the global north, and as a result, the global south was becoming increasingly poor. And again, what I find interesting is that if you take one of the journals, like the Journal of Development Economics in the 1950s and 60s, all of these ideas were being very much elaborated in that context. And it was very much those two camps as being one and the same. Why did divergence take place? I think there have been two different phases of the divergence between development economics and the political economy of development. The first divergence is very much around ideology and policy and takes place in the late 1980s and the 1990s. This is a moment in which actually a lot of the work of the pioneers is recuperated by a set of political economists that are writing about East Asia and that are finding that actually part of the miracle, the Asian miracle, had a lot to do with implementing the type of policies that the pioneers of development were recommending, and had a lot to do also with understanding the place in the global economy that East Asia was occupying and how different it was to the Latin American context as well. The result was very much a whole set of ideas by authors like Alice Amsden, Peter Evans, Hao Yu Chan, and others around very much how do you organize policy and industrial policy to promote specific sectors of the economy. This is the debate about picking winners, whether you can select specific sectors to develop and build linkages to others, again, with a link to the pioneers of development. It's also the idea of the principle of reciprocity, the idea that you can give incentives to companies, but in exchange you need to put specific conditions, particularly in terms of export performance. And this is a literature in the 1990s that pays a lot of attention to the power relations and the relationship between the state and society. Robert Way talks about governing the market, and Peter Evans talks about embedded autonomy, the idea that the state needed to be independent from, but linked to the social actors, and particularly the business elite. Of course, they are writing at a time where development economics is moving in a very different direction, both in terms of their notion of the state and the thinking about trade and macroeconomics. This is the period of the Washington Consensus. This is the period of the new political economy, the neoclassical political economy, which is a whole set of theories about why the state does not work, in contrast to why the state works in this literature. And it's also, of course, about the importance of free markets and the liberalization of trade. It's increasingly also a separation, a methodological separation, although that comes much more clearly later on. I think it's interesting because these 1990s were actually a period in which the political economy of development is relatively coherent around these ideas of a structural change and this Asian miracle, and it also can offer a total and absolute clear contrast to the Washington Consensus. So again, there were very significant debates between people like Alice Amsden and the World Bank, in which both sat at the same table, but expressing very different views and ideas. The second stage of the divergence is actually much more methodological and takes place in the late 1990s, 2000s, and up to today. Is methodological because in the first is there's a mainstream criticism of the political economy of development, and especially the pioneers, because of their lack of mathematical rigor. Here, Paul Krugman was extremely important. He has a very nice but wrong, in my view, essay about the relationship between development economics and the pioneers. And let me quote what he has to say. High development theorists, so pioneers of development, were having a hard time expressing their ideas in the kind of tightly specified models that were increasingly becoming the unique language on discourse in economic analysis. They were faced with the choice of either adopting that increasingly dominant intellectual style or finding themselves pushed in the intellectual periphery. They didn't make the transition, and as a result, development theory was largely purged from economics, even development economics. And I think this reveals very much the view from a lot of the development economists about the function and the role of others. I remember one of those mainstream economists, development economists, calling the work of Alice Amsden economic anthropology. Not that that's a problem, but basically minimizing the contribution that this could do to economics. And this methodological separation, as Jayati said, is even more clear with the credibility revolution in development economics and in economics more generally. As you know, economics has actually moved from being a highly theoretical to an extremely applied social science, in which the idea of how you are able to determine causality has become a key discussion, a key element for discussion. So how you identify your strategy of identification to actually determine how you can build causal stories has become the only, one would say, the only preoccupation of development economics. And in fact, in that sense, development economics has become one of the key disciplines in economics because of the use, again, as Jayati was saying, of the role of randomized controlled trials. So it's the idea that we need to do experiments of different kinds to actually be able to draw causal explanations and to be able to be clear about how that takes place. And I think that's one of the key ways in which then development economics is separated from the political economy of development, which thinks about causal explanations in a much more qualitative and in a much more open way. In terms of the discussion that we are having, I think this move to thinking about the internal validity of the research we do meant that external validity was much less significant, and meant also that the questions that are being answered are much smaller. So let me give you a short quote from Poor Economics, which is a book for the general public in which Banerjee and Duflo very much expose the importance of randomized experiments. And they said, it is possible to make very significant progress against the big problem of the world by the accumulation of a set of small steps. The studies we use have in common a high level of scientific rigor. And this is very much this idea that you have to be small in terms of the questions you answer. To be rigorous has become extremely dominant in development economics. So they go on to say, we cannot pronounce on the efficiency of, on the efficacy of democracy, but we do have something to say about whether democracy could be made more effective in rural Indonesia by changing the way it is organized on the ground, and so on and on and on. It could not be farther from a discipline that tries to answer the big questions of the polycrisis that we are experiencing in terms of inequality, the environmental challenges, or the geopolitical challenges that we are experiencing. At the same time as this is happening and the higher, more significant divergence is taking place, I think there are also changes in political economy that have in some ways weakened our discipline, or my discipline. The first is that the political economy became more dispersed in terms of topics. So the amount of topics that were being discussed were much broader, from the environment to how we do to transport, to the political economy of transportation, or think about other issues. And there were very much less interactions between them. In fact, I was trying to think about what were books that were similar to what Governing the Market or where The Rise of the Rest were in the late 1990s, and it's just much harder to think about the defining books of the political economy of development today, maybe because there's many more of those books. I also think that the discipline has actually become less influential from a policy perspective, partly because the development agenda has moved to the Sustainable Development Goals, has moved to think about poverty, has moved to think about others in which, but less, at least for a time, although things are changing a little in the last few years, about bigger questions about structural transformation or industrial policy. And of course, in the UK context in particular, we also have the weakening of the influence of political economy because of the move from international development to global development and all of those debates that are taking place about what is the development studies is for and how much it should actually think about the global instead of thinking about the particular economies of countries in the global south. So I want to conclude with two quick questions to answer. The first is, how can we accumulate knowledge in the political economy of development? How can we make it slightly more coherent, or at least create more conversations between those of us that work in that discipline? And the other is, how can we build links to mainstream economics, which I think is still important and interesting, and it's in fact what we are here to discuss today. In terms of the accumulation of knowledge, I think it's important to think about the political economic development in terms of three big elements: the policy, the politics, and the institutions, and how we can think about the key questions in each of those areas. So in terms of policy, I think in one way or another, the work in this field is focusing on, first, industrial policy, the process of transformation, which has become increasingly influential in recent years. Again, the process of redistribution, how we think about social policy in ways that reduce inequality in a more systematic way, the green transition, and therefore the green industrial policy element, and then the policy interactions. A lot of interesting debate, but we need to think about the conversations between those writing in those debates. It's about how social policy might or might not link to industrial policy. In terms of institutions, I think debates about the role of the state are actually more important today than, or as important as ever before. If you remember, there was a time in which we thought that nation states were not relevant anymore. I actually think that the last couple of years are demonstrating that the nation state is still a very important and significant variable to consider, and that is one which we need to understand better in terms of how it is structured. And of course, if we do that, we also need to think about the different ways in which dependence is being produced and reproduced. And again, I think the role of the US and China today give a lot of importance to that question. And finally, in terms of politics, I hope we can accumulate more knowledge. We can speak more about state-society relations and the role of transnational corporations. And of course, I do think that DSA has potentially a very important role to play in organizing some more of those conversations to try to recuperate the political economy of development as a field that is somewhat coherent around the notion of debates on the state, debates on policies, and debates on institutions. Now, what about the links to economics? I actually think that the link to development, to mainstream development economics is actually too hard at the moment, and I would agree with Ati on those elements. I think development economics is very much now committed to this notion of how we do rigorous analysis through randomized experiments and almost natural experiments, and that that has also created a very significant differences in terms of the questions that we are being asked. I think development economics has less to say about big questions around inequality, big social policies, not particular interventions on the ground or others. But that doesn't mean that there are not other parts of economics in which those links can be more significant. In particular, I'm thinking about some parts of economics that are rediscovering the role of history and the role of conversations between different disciplines in an equal basis. Here I have in mind different work, but for example, I think the work by the Paris School of Economics and Thomas Piketty around inequality is one of the very big elements where this is possible. And let me actually finish with a quote from Capital in the 21st Century, which I think for me reveals how we need to think about those links and how we need to think about a social science that is able to build more common conversations. He has to say, the discipline of economics has yet to get over its childish passion for mathematics. One would say passion for randomized experiments as well, but I haven't said that. And for purely theoretical and often highly ideological speculation at the expense of historical research and collaboration with other social sciences. I think if we truly take this seriously, we will see that there's a comparative political economy to build that has elements of mainstream economics, but that is built in a very detailed understanding of history and the countries we care about. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, lots of food for thought there. And I think two very interestingly complementary presentations, Jayati giving us a broader view of economics as a discipline, and Diego a slightly more precisely defined comparison of political economy and development economics, reminding us that there's lots of heterogeneity within economics, which we should pay account of, while also reflecting on it, the fact that it is, relative to development studies at least, a very tight discipline. So we have to play with that homogeneity and that heterogeneity and think about that as we reflect. I think what I suggest we do is actually just give you 5 minutes to talk with your neighbor before we ask questions, to reflect a bit. You can ask them what kind of economist they are, if you don't know them, because we're all a little bit economists if we do development studies. And then we will take 3 questions and we will ask Diego and Jayati to reply, okay?
Right.
Can I take?
Do you mind swapping over to this one? Cool. So these ones can go into the
and then I will pass that to Diego.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if I just say Jayati, she will hear me and she will be able to.
Yeah.
As long as she's unmuted.
Yeah, that's okay.
Great. Fantastic. Yes. Wonderful.
Yeah, there should be ultimately. Yeah. So let's have a discussion.
One economy is their training.
I'm gonna take this to and then I'll get
No,
It should be just.
So,
I haven't found it.
yeah, but I think what you did very well there was remind people of some of the core. It's easy to realize that other people don't know. Yes, and to be precise about terms is, and you're right. I think I love your idea that actually in a way the development economies to define themselves, you know, have almost become a technical. Yes. And maybe their is as people want to, because they don't want to be seen to be soft. Yes. So they have to be hardened as developed economies. Yeah, there might be another field. Yes. And I think you're, yeah, really good. This from being criticized for an excess of abstraction in Ricardo's vice to now being criticized for an excess of unfortunately business of God and complete reinvention. Yet the same discipline has managed to change its kind of norms. Although of course there are still the pure theorists there. Yeah. So, but no, I think we've still got 35 minutes, and it's just people need to engage. Yes. Have we had 5 minutes? Yeah. Right, I think we nearly had 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, right. Well, if you're too busy talking, you're going to miss out on asking a question. So I've got the first hand over there. So we're going to take 3 questions or brief comments, and I will cut you off if you're too long, because then I won't be able to make a long statement at the end. So we've got one there. Second question in the middle. Yeah, you got there quickly. And I was going to go over there, but you were so quick. I'm going to go for you. Yes. So 3 of you. Okay. And then we'll take another round and another round. And the faster we are, the more we'll do.
Hi,
Say who you are first, please.
yeah, hello, my name's Kurt Zem. I'm a term assistant professor at Barnard College. First thing, Diego, I also got my PhD at the New School. Defended my dissertation a month ago. And I just wanted to, I'm political economist trained, and I agreed with both presentations. And I've actually had the pleasure of working a little bit with Jayati, so it's not my first time hearing her brilliance, but I was born in Germany. Grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm just a very Westernly trained political economist. And I really want to help and kind of reach out with my research into the global South, but then also realizing my own ignorance. So just from both your perspectives, what are ways that kind of more Westernly trained scholars can actually reach out, do research in the global South without kind of what Jayati was alluding to, going, well, I have a model and I study water economics and you have water in everywhere. How do I not just apply my model to those places and actually organically reach out to people? And also, hi, Jayati.
So that's a great question to us all. If we meet a friendly political economist, how do we engage them? Yeah, even if they haven't moved outside their hometown or whatever. Right, so 2 more questions up here.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Mehroosh Tak. I'm a political economist trained from SOAS, but I'm at the Royal Veterinary College at the moment. I can talk about why at the Vet College, which is kind of like where I'm going right now. Great conversations. Thanks so much for the keynote speakers. My question is, are we talking to the wrong people by talking to just economists and talking about economics and social science only? The reason I ask this is because the people who are in charge of making decisions around, say, water distribution or like investments in development, they're all technocrats essentially, or like politicians. And why we're not speaking to like natural scientists, and I wonder like our critical thinking in this room might be more useful speaking to those guys rather than just mainstream economists and trying to convince the RCT guys that they need to think like us. Why don't we just skip that, leapfrog that? And I mean, I'm not saying that we don't do that, but I'm just possibly a comment from both Jayati and the other keynote speakers, just to kind of think through who else should we be speaking to rather than just the mainstream economists who are creating
Great.
models.
Great. So forget the economists, they're irrelevant. We just need to read Judea Pearl and talk with the tech bros. Yeah. Okay. And we all have to read, well, anyway. Yeah. Great question.
Hi, my name is Enrique Castañón Vallevian. I'm a lecturer in international development at the Institute of the Americas at UCL. So my question is to Diego. I really like both presentations, I have to say, and I really like, of course, the last quote from Piketty was really nice, you know, and I appreciate the spirit that we have to try to engage with each other, learn from different disciplines. I think that's the right path. At some point, Diego, though, you suggested that political economy of development can still have productive links with mainstream economics. And given Jayati's devastating and very powerful critique of the mainstream camp, I really struggle how that could be productive. I recognize political economy of development with the heterodox kind of camp, but I'm not really quite sure how that collaboration could be built with the, you know, hardcore mainstream economics. I don't see that happening. So I was just puzzled by your suggestion that that is a link that we should still pursue.
Okay. So, Jayati, we've been very quiet up there for a long time. So we'll give you the first chance to respond to those three first questions.
Well, thanks a lot. And those are great questions, all of them. Kurt, great to see you here. I wish I could meet again in person, and I hope we will soon. Yeah, you know, it's really, I mean, I don't want to say that, you know, anybody who goes to any other society is not qualified to talk about that or to provide any insights or to provide knowledge, etc., etc. And particularly, I mean, I really think that those who have been trained in a different way, in a more heterodox way, say in the new school, are much more likely to be aware of context specificities, etc. We have had fantastic interactions in the developing world with people from the global north who came specifically to help out. For example, in that, you know, in the golden days of development economics that Diego so beautifully outlined, in India, the second plan onwards were massively assisted by help from people like Mikhail Kaleski, Rosenstein Rodan, Galbraith. I mean, you know, all the luminaries came to help out. Now, one of the reasons why they were actually helpful is because they first listened. And I think that's the big difference with what we have today. Today, we do not have a lot of the mainstream and a lot of the policy advisors who are influenced by the mainstream, whether it is World Bank people or it is, you know, all the consultancies, etc. They don't listen. They have the model, as you say, they have the model and they go out there and they say, okay, here's how you apply this model. And if you don't do it, and if the results are not what I expect, then you've done it wrong, is more or less what is said. So I think the critical difference is the people who are willing to listen. And I do feel heterodox economists are, I hope, more trained to listen and to actually be aware of all the historical, social, cultural contexts, as well as the fundamental difference in terms of the relationships of dependency and the historical and colonial and post-colonial contexts that Diego outlined. So, you know, that would be my response. Are we talking to the wrong kind of people? Was it Aru? I couldn't get the name so well, but yeah. Are we talking? No, listen, you have to talk to everybody, huh? You cannot sort of say, I will not talk to technologists or I will not talk to the water engineers, I mean, and so on. But you cannot afford not to talk to the mainstream economists. Why? Because they're just so damn powerful. They still determine, they're in the heads of policymakers. I mean, I don't know a single developing country, and I visit a lot of places and I interact with a lot of different policymakers in the developing world. I don't know of a single one who has not spent at least 2 months being trained in one of the Bretton Woods institutions or one of those other ways in which they train you into a particular epistemological worldview. And to undo that is critical because that's how bureaucracies function. That's how then they influence the ministerial positions, and it goes all the way down to the ground. There are assumptions and ideas about how things play out and what has to be done and, Tina, etc., those are really now, they're in the mind of policymakers everywhere. So you can't afford not to talk to the mainstream, okay? Having said that, also finally, I want to pick up on Enrique. It's not a question to me, but there's mainstream and mainstream. So it's a very interesting, complicated thing. I mean, there was a point when Jeff Sachs was a very mainstream economist. Now he's saying things that, more radical than I would say. There was a point, I mean, Joe Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize winner for very important mainstream work, but he has very, very useful, important insights to give us. And I keep learning a lot from him, actually, because he's open. So you get different kinds of mainstream economists as well. It's not that, there's just this one homogeneous body that is influencing. I mean, there are the very, if I dare say it, the very macho, aggressive kind who will not part from their particular worldview. But there are many others who are more open. And it is necessary to not just talk to them, but to exchange with them, to learn from them, and have them hopefully learn from us. So it's more complicated than, it's basically we should avoid silos as much as possible. So I go with Diego in terms of how we have to also talk with some mainstream economists, the ones who are open. And we should be open as well in that sense, not necessarily to complete false assumptions, but to other things. There's another thing I just wanted to mention, if I could add a little bit. I thought I had finished my time, so I didn't add it, but it was about a criticism of us in heterodox political economy as well. And it's not necessarily everybody, again, it's always, just some, but there has been a tendency in what I would call the development industry, international development industry, and it's very marked in the donor countries, where you have, of course you have the mainstream consultants, but you have others, very well-meaning people, very, with the best intentions and so on, to go for fads. So, you keep seeing these fads where suddenly this one thing takes over, is the magic bullet that is going to solve everything. So we go from, let's say, microcredit being the big solution everywhere, to cash transfers being the big solution everywhere, and so on. So there has been this tendency for fads, and then to move on to the next thing, which I think is problematic. And there is a tendency to, how shall I put it, to ignore a lot of the really bad reality. I have been attending a lot of discussions at the UN, and prior to the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla, I'm actually in Barcelona right now, but before that, I have been either virtually or physically attending a whole bunch of different UN and other development organizations talking about the world and what to do and etc. And everybody wants to wish away. How shall I put it? It's as if the last 3 months haven't happened. It's as if, the world order as we knew it has not been completely transformed by Trump, the tariffs. It's not just the tariffs, the sheer display of, if you like, jungle power, as opposed to what was a very problematic rule of law of the international order. And so, we have to stop doing that. We have to recognize when reality changes, and we have to change our strategies accordingly. Okay, stopping here.
Okay, thank you, Jayati. Over to you, Diego.
Perfect. Thank you very much. The first, how to engage with the Global South. So I think a couple of answers to that. The first is by learning the big contributions that even for Western political economy they have done. So I think we shouldn't forget that dependency theory is very much something coming from the Global South, and now it has it had for a time a very significant influence in Western political economy, but it very much came. And I do think that the whole structuralist political economy had an influence on heterodox thinking, right? Lance Taylor, for example, and his work cannot be understood if you don't understand structuralism in Latin America. And then the second, I think, is much more political or ideological, which is to be very modest and very curious and to really go and listen to how others are thinking about some of these problems, for me becomes extremely important. On the why don't we speak with other scientists? I'm actually a little bit afraid that those scientists do not want to talk to us nearly as much. So I'm not sure natural scientists really want to talk to us much more than economists. However, I do think that you are right that there are some interactions around system theory and other elements where clearly there's a lot of potential conversations to have, and of course around industrial policy as well. I think the work of industrial policy calls for a conversation with those that are doing research and development in a much more clear way. So in that, I agree with you that that's complementary. And then how can we collaborate with mainstream economists given the criticisms that we have elaborated? I think the first thing I would say is we need to, because they are too influential and too powerful. So it's not talking to them moves us to the periphery in many of the key debates that are taking place. The second is because I do think that the move to the discipline of economics being extremely empiricist has actually created some opportunities for those conversations that were less so when it was a very theoretical analysis. So again, I do think Piketty has been very influential in mainstream economics, and the work of how to think about inequality has been very influential. It's obviously, its model of the economy is very mainstream, and if you want to criticize in terms of how they think about capital, of course, but in terms of how they are thinking about history and how are they thinking about data, I think it's a different way than others, and that creates a conversation. Or the work of Danny Roderick in development, or Acemoglu and Robinson. I don't know that is any more interesting than political economy. I think it's less interesting, but I do think that there's a lot of possibilities to talk, and to that way also make mainstream economics slightly more diverse than it currently is.
I'm remembering Robinson giving a plenary at the Development Studies Association in Oxford a few years ago. And it was a sort of opening because, not for the first time, there was a sense that he was discovering something that we all knew. So you can say, well, you've just discovered something we all knew, or you can say, yeah, great, let's have a conversation about it. So plus ça change. 3 more questions. I'm going to start over here. You're pointing to somebody else. That's great. A long time ago. Okay, well, I will take that recommendation on the grounds of your altruism, because I wanted to go here first. And I will take you, and I'm going to take 4, and I'm going to ask our respondents to be quicker, and Asha and Eel.
Should I start?
So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, you start.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Pradeep Kumar Chaudhary. I teach education economics at JNU. So thanks to listen Jayati here in this. One interesting thing that comes to my mind is about teaching economics. Because in the changes that we see in the labor market, the changes that we see in the other disciplines, the teaching economics is being reshaped in different universities, also in the social context. That is actually leading a confusion among students that I find. When I teach to the students, I find that what actually they need, because they are interacting with the labor market, they know that they will be employed once they will be skilled in RCT training and all that. So that confuses a bit to students and also younger teachers like me. So what is your impression in that? Thank you.
Great. So teaching of economics, how do we tackle that? Theo?
Okay. Your Butcher from University of Bristol. My question is for Diego. I love the presentation and mainly the accumulation of knowledge in the slide that you show politics, institutions, and policy. However, where would you put colonialism and colonial relations that has evolved over the past 500 years in shaping all the policies, the politics, and institutions across the world? Both your framework and even Andy Sumner's framework are, I think, quite the colonial element is quite absent. Where would America be without slave trade or cotton capital or sugar capital? Where would the UK be? So that we explain things differently from understanding the broader history of the global political economy and the production system. I think missing that and just simply having the conversation below a certain level would definitely be very limiting. What do you think?
Okay, so bringing coloniality back in. We had, yes, in the middle. Yeah, yeah. And then.
Thank you very much. My question is,
And who are you?
sorry? I'm Katarzyna Sislik from GDI Manchester. And my question is actually a little defense of small questions. I think that your very well articulated critique of the randomized control trials and the obsession with measurement is very much correct. But there are different types of small questions. And I think that they have a power to undermine the big narratives and assumptions that the big theories are very often funded on. So if you're thinking about political economy, answering the big questions, we need to have small questions to question the big questions. Is that not correct?
So in defense of small questions and incrementalism, yes. One more question from Asha. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Asha. I'm from the University of Bath, and I really enjoyed both of those talks. So thank you very much. My question is for Jayati, because Jayati, I really liked what you said about basically what I understood you to be saying is that economists, mainstream economists, need to unlearn what they have learned. And they need to incorporate history, they need to incorporate politics, they need to incorporate culture into what they do in order to be able to actually do something, understand this world and then do something about it, right? And so that leads me to think then about sort of modern academia and the way that it's structured. And the fact that we have a proliferation of specializations and of disciplines and sub-disciplines within them. And these boundaries are actually quite policed. And I understand that as, well, yes, they are policed, even though there's fluidity between them. And I understand that as a result of the sort of corporatization of the university and the corporatization, I think, of social life as well. But I wonder what you think about how we, as people within academia, need to resist and fight that. Because I, at least, call me old-fashioned, but I'm guessing there's many people that will agree with me in this room. I yearn for the days of generalism, when you could be a political philosopher, you could be an anthropologist, you could be a soil, an agroeconomist, and I like that. And so, yeah, just I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay, thank you. So actually the last and the first question sort of connect a little bit around the teaching of economics and how it could be done differently. We're going to stick to, yeah, Jayati, why don't you go first again, unless you want to.
Okay, sure. No, I'd love to. And I will try to be brief, although these are big questions. Pradeep, hi, nice to see you also virtually. Listen, when I teach anything, and I used to teach international economics in JNU and development, the first thing you do when you're dealing with any model is to say, these are all the assumptions. And it's these assumptions that are critical. Look at how important they are, see how realistic they are, see what happens to that model if that assumption doesn't hold. And if, in fact, that assumption doesn't hold for any economy you can think of, then frankly, don't use that model. And you can do that over and over again in many different ways. And I think you can definitely do that in the economics of education. And the whole idea that a skill, will get you a job, etc. There are so many assumptions built into those kinds of arguments. It's easy to unpack them and say, well, actually, it depends. And then you know on what it depends. And so basically, that's how I teach both the mainstream and other theories and models. But I think, again, in that teaching, you have to constantly be recognizing context, history, society, culture, etc. You can't say this is only about an economic phenomenon which has nothing, which is not embedded in that broader society. And in a way, I'm going to link that with Asha's question, because I think that's a fascinating question. You're so right, it's so policed. And it's everywhere. Huh? I currently at UMass, it's supposedly a heterotox department. And we were hiring. It was a terrible fight, terrible, terrible, to shortlist anybody who was not defined as an economist. If they did, let us say, if they were historians of economic thought, but they had a PhD in history, although they were historians of economic thought, no. Okay, so it is, I mean, the policing is at every level and it's in people's minds. It's a different kind of colonization, right? Or notions of power or whatever. But yeah, it's really tough. But the only thing I'm a little encouraged to see in many, many universities is the rise of these what are called interdisciplinary centers. I mean, I was in London recently, and I find that both SOAS and UCL have got lots of interdisciplinary centers with all kinds of people in them. An economist, an anthropologist, a philosopher in a center, I think it was International Growth and Prosperity or something, as somebody, a climatologist, an anthropologist, a disaster relief person, etc., in another interdisciplinary center. So maybe more and more places are recognizing that you don't really get knowledge production without bringing together all these different perspectives. And just if I can, my own personal experience, and this relates also to the question about whether scientists want to talk to us at all. I was involved in a project of, we did a report to the Club of Rome. The report is out as a book. It's called Earth for All. But it's 50 years after the original Club of Rome book, if you remember, Limits to Growth. So it was brought out half a century later to sort of look at the issue afresh. And it had natural scientists. It had two of the original authors of the Club of Rome thing. It had natural scientists, it had climatologists, it had modelers, it had philosophers, it had historians, it had economists, it had anthropologists. And, we fought a lot, we argued a lot, and we managed to put together a volume, which I think is much better for all of that discussion. So yeah, I really do think that the future of knowledge is going to be that way, because people are going to realize you can't understand half of what's going on without all of these different kinds of inputs, whether it is AI or it's climate change, or it is all the geopolitical fractures that we're seeing, or polarization, anything. You can't understand all of that without the multiple perspectives. On the
And Jayati,
you have to finish? Okay.
You're very scary. You're very
Sorry?
scary because you're about 10 feet tall. But
I
I'm
have to
going to
move
ask
back.
you to just answer a little bit more quickly.
Yes,
Okay.
but listen, I did get 10 minutes less in the beginning, so I'm just gonna try and answer the two questions. One, on the colonial period, I completely agree with the importance of that. And interestingly, Piketty, along with his young colleague Gaston Nivas, Thomas Piketty and Gaston Nivas have done a very interesting new paper on 3 centuries of extraction using balance of payments data. And it's a fascinating historical paper. It is imbued with knowledge which they don't realize because they don't quote it. But it is imbued with knowledge that comes from Walter Rodney, who talked about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, from Omyo Bagchi, who has a fantastic book of Perilous Passage, the Ascendancy of Capital and Humankind, and Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik, who have a fabulous book on imperialism. So sometimes there's a lot of knowledge that is not recognized in the Global South, but I think Piketty and Nivas have done a great work in terms of quantifying some of the important theoretical and analytical and conceptual insights of that whole impact of the whole colonization. And finally, in the defense of the small questions, I think all questions are important, but it's not a small question. It is usually a big question which you can answer in a small way, in a local way, or in a slightly meso way, or in a macro way. I don't think any question is small. I think the problem is that you think you can take a micro thing, a micro analysis, and apply that result to everything else or to other contexts without taking those differences into account.
Very quickly, these are great questions and things to continue thinking about as a group, not just on whatever we have to answer. But on teaching economics, for me, the two key elements are first to teach it in a way that creates a conversation between different schools of thought is particularly important. And the second is that it's organized around problems. So I think if we combine those, or if we have different ways of doing that, we will actually teach economics much more effectively than we are currently doing. On colonial relations, I agree. I obviously, probably I was biased because I work less on that element, but for me, dependency is how to bring it, right? And for example, one of the key building blocks of political economy is a work by Cardoso and Faleto, two Latin Americans very much thinking about the roots of dependency in the colonial relations. So clearly, one of the key elements of this political economic development has to be dependency and has to build those links to other thinkers in that area. On small questions, I think for me the key, you are right, the small questions are obviously important. The key is whether those small questions are being placed in a broader framework that is a coherent framework of how to explain the world and how to explain things like quality and democracy, or is not placed in that type. And for me, part of the problem in development economics today is that it's so focused on policy responses at the micro that is not building an explanation of why we are in a world of polycrisis and why how we think about democracy or inequality, and how those small research is actually building a better understanding of that bigger categories. And then finally, although it was not for me, I think the interesting thing is that we are not maximizing even the spaces that we have created for conversation. So I don't know in Bath, but for us in Oxford, both in area studies and international development, it's very complicated to create conversation even among us in the Department of International Development. If we are not able to, even in a department that is by definition multidisciplinary, to actually create those conversations, we cannot create them anywhere else. So I would start by trying to think about how it is that we can promote most of those conversations in spaces that exist in the UK more than in other countries like the US, which are development studies and area studies.
I can't resist butting in quickly, having taught development economics for 35 years, and actually throw up a model as a thought experiment, the multitask problem in economics. Yeah, if you are trying to assess performance and it's difficult to measure, find a measurable proxy. So a little bit of political economy analysis informed by economics of the economics profession is that the economics profession solves the multitask problem by creating a tournament around excellence in maths and statistics, which is very effective as a filter for enabling people like Paul Collier and Krugman and others to pass the test, and Stiglitz, yeah, to reproduce the system with lots of path dependence, refusing to let their students talk to people in development studies because it will corrupt them and distract them from learning the statistics. And then to come out of the tournament, having proven themselves, and become global spokespeople about the problems of the world. So the good news for young academics is if you hang around and you win the tournament, whatever your silo, then you get promoted and you have to be transdisciplinary. Yeah? So hang on in there and let's learn a little bit from some of those mechanisms by which other fields and other professions achieve influence and excellence, and actually learn from it rather than just criticizing it. So my little homily over, and we've got time for one more set of questions very quickly. This looks like bias, but you did have your hand up first, and you had your hand up first, and you had your hand up just now. Yeah, Katerina. So 1, 2, 3, and try and be fairly brief because we want to finish in 3 minutes.
So a few years back, Joe Devine from the University of Bath, a few years back, quite a few students in the UK rebelled against the way that economics was being taught. And there was various strands to that. The one that interested me was the lack of ethics and integrity in the discipline. And essentially they were saying, you know, economics has been forced in a way that basically we've got a bunch of technocrats who are focused obsessively on efficiency. And then you've got a whole series of panels going on this today, yesterday, about how we're, prioritizing growth over other indicators, et cetera, et cetera. So my question really isn't about economics, because my guess is that economics have just excelled at a bad job, the kind of things that you've presented us with, but the rest of social sciences isn't far behind. So it's a bit of a warning to those of us within development studies who are not economists, that we equally could quickly go down that road of becoming the equivalent of, technocrats obsessed with efficiency, instead of asking really deep, serious, critical questions that would make us relevant. And I don't think that's just purely a problem for economics.
Okay, beware being over technical. Yeah.
Thank you. Jean Felice, University of Edinburgh. I could make it very long, but to make it very short, what do we do with numbers? What do we do with numbers?
What do we do with numbers? Great.
Okay. Katerina Lehner from the University of Bath. I just wanted to continue the conversation about how to enter into a conversation with mainstream economics. And we've talked about sometimes the off chance that collegiality brings forward, can promote these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations. And another one that I'm wondering about, based on my personal experience of doing research about the politics of poverty statistics, in the course of which I talked to a lot of statisticians, was that they often, and I think that there's a broader observation here that many development economists are close to government and are close to donors that have a political agenda. And in these conversations about the work they do, they often speak very openly about the politics of this. And I wonder if there isn't more of a fruitful conversation to be had by bringing these conversations out that happen during research, and sort of encouraging interdisciplinary thinking about the politics of modeling, bringing that more out in the open, and thinking about what underlies the choices between different potential models that all have internal validity, but where one is chosen over the other for very obvious political reasons.
Okay, thank you. Diego, you go first.
Perfect. Very quickly. So I do think that, yes, it's a risk that all we worry on efficiency, although for other social sciences that are very much focused on power, that risk is not as significant. So I do hope that for political economy of development and development studies, the fact that we are thinking about power, inequalities, and the distribution of power will minimize that risk, but the risk exists. What do we do with numbers? I would say two things. One is question them, and economies are as good. The good economists are as good as questioning numbers as anyone, and thinking about statistics in different ways. And the second is to create more possibilities for conversation through, for example, mixed methods. I do hope that we can advance the agenda of mixed methods in a way that not only makes the work more interesting, but creates more bridges between the two disciplines I was talking about. And on the politics of statistics, of numbers, of models, I couldn't agree more. So I have less to add than to say I agree with you that we should bring the work on political economy that is centered on power to also thinking about research, but to also to think about policy making in all the different areas.
Yeah, we're supposed to be good at sort of combining the informal and the formal. And so often in conversations with economists, I have really interesting informal conversations that actually are often the intuition for the most interesting paper, for them as well as me. Jayati, you have the last word.
Oh my goodness, that's terrifying. Look, I really agree with everything that was just said by Diego and by you. Apropos the informality, I have found talking to people from other disciplines, really, a good dinner with some nice wine is one of the best ways of getting things going, actually, in my experience. What do we do with numbers? Absolutely what Diego just said. Question them. Don't take them over seriously. Don't be obsessed with them. But of course, make sure you know what goes into the numbers that you're using, and then use them with some degree of caution. finally, I really cannot, I mean, I have huge problems with the term efficiency and the term productivity. I think they're conceptually weak and empirically poorly defined. We could have a whole different discussion on that. But maybe we also have to start questioning some of those things which are taken as holy grails. I'm actually finished, done.
Right, we're now 4 minutes over, so I failed in my job. Thank you, everybody, for questions. We could talk about this a lot more. I hope we've all been encouraged and stimulated to think about this again and to avoid that dreaded word schismogenesis. And so many thanks again to Jayati and to Diego.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, that was really good.